Hi, everybody. Real quick, Tito here. Just want to let you know one of our recordings didn't quite record. So for part of the recording, we do have to go to the master track, which means there's going to be a little bit more crosstalk and background noise than you will be used to. Apologies. It's still a great episode. McBanterFace is a wonderful guest. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome back to Bread and Butter, everybody. We're serving up the basics for Hearthstone improvement in episode 93, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Tito Santana. Tito, how are you doing?
Doc, I am doing just fine, but no one wants to hear about me today. We have an amazing guest. Let's talk to him.
Yeah, listeners, we have the one, the only McBanterFace. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing well. I just woke up 30 minutes ago or 45 minutes ago, as is my usual strange sleep schedule, so I'm getting adjusted to my day, but doing all right.
Well, thank you for joining us first thing in the morning. So, McBanterFace, what have you been doing inside of Hearthstone recently?
I've been doing a lot of spectating, that's for sure. I have not been playing a ton of Hearthstone. Last meta or two has kind of been whatever for me. So I've been trying to just keep up streams, but I have not been able to do my, somewhat normal, playing 5 or 6 hours a day or something. It's just been too much. So I've kind of just turned my stream a lot of days into more of a just chatting type of thing with Hearthstone as the background. Just talk about whatever, occasionally, cast one of the games or two basically, but I have not been playing a whole lot.
So what is it about the meta that's not grabbing you?
The biggest thing for me is it's not like a balance issue or anything like that. It's mostly just there's not really anything new, and I play a lot of Hearthstone compared to 99.9% of people. So I'm so used to already having all these cards and playing with all these decks. So now it kind of feels like it's been a few months of them, Insanity Warlock and all this stuff. There's 2 new decks now that kind of popped up. There's Pipsy Paladin and Big Spell Mage. But apart from that is basically all the decks that we had, even as far back as a year ago. So I've basically just been kind of trying to take it easy and not, play it too much, because I do have to play a lot in the next 2 months for Worlds qualification. So I'm saving my energy for that.
Doc, how about yourself? What have you been playing in Hearthstone?
Yeah, so I've been playing quite a bit of BGs. I'm almost up to 5K, which for me is pretty high. But I've also been playing a lot of Wild. I've been playing a lot of Even Shaman, which is it's just a very polarizing aggro deck. I've been getting a lot of turn 4, turn 5 lethals with just a bunch of giant totems. And it's been a lot of fun. I'm really, really enjoying Wild. And I've discovered how little I've played that mode because I'm getting all the achievement points for hitting bronze 5, silver 10, silver 5, so on and so on. And so, yeah, it's a mode that I have just never played because I've never been interested. And since talking with Schmoopy last week, I am really enjoying the mode, and I'm glad that I'm having fun with it. And there's been some very fun, interesting decks that I've been able to see in Wild. How about yourself, Tino?
Well, Doc, if you do hit Legend in Wild, we'll count it. Even though I know Daniel says it doesn't exist, it doesn't really count. But I will count it if you hit Legend in Wild before you hit Legend in Standard. I have been sort of just not really playing a ton this week. It's for me, I'm not playing a ton. It's odd. I took a couple nights off from streaming. Although I did have my matches last night. So last night in duos with me and Pilot, we played Copa and Hustle. And because we both just barely missed the playoffs, we decided to do some really weird decks. And we played some Pipsy Paladin, which I really like. And we played some Menagerie Warrior. And we played Spell Mage. And Spell Mage just did not get us there. It was just not good enough. Although we might have missed lethal on one turn. Although Pilot says we didn't. I think we might have. It was a lot of fun. It was good. It was interesting. I just picked up Mech Warrior, because it seems like that's kind of up and coming, and that's a lot of fun. It's a little weird, but I think there's potential there, so we're going to ride that for a little bit. And I'm looking forward to getting back to when the month changes over, I'm gonna play a lot more on Overheal Priest now that I kind of understand the deck and I feel pretty comfortable with it. But we'll kind of talk about those kind of decks in a little while. But McBanterFace, what have you been doing outside of the game of Hearthstone?
I've been doing a handful of things. I've kind of not been streaming as much. I've had a bit more free time in general, which is kind of nice. I just got back from TwitchCon last weekend. I went out to that. Not a super far trip for me. It was in San Diego. But drove up there, had a really good time, got to meet a bunch of Hearthstone people. Some of them I had already met. Some were new faces. So that was a lot of fun. Apart from that, I don't know, just spending time with friends. I picked up pickleball semi-recently, which I know is more of like people call it like an old people sport, but I've been enjoying that a lot. So we made that like a weekly thing. I always do that right before I stream, which is a nice time.
Now, when you were at TwitchCon, do you feel like you're kind of like a minor celebrity when you're amongst Hearthstone people? Do people come up to you like, "Oh, you're McBanterFace" and whatever, or do you feel like you kind of
amongst Hearthstone people? I kind of, but like in general, in the scope of TwitchCon, it's like I'm nobody. Like nobody's gonna know me. I did actually get recognized once, like at the very start of the weekend, which was kind of funny. Like because just in general, I'm compared to all these like huge creators at TwitchCon, and also Hearthstone is kind of its own small bubble. I didn't really expect to get recognized at all, but I walked in my hotel room, and they're like, before I even went to the convention, I got in the elevator with one other person. He like looked at me and was like, do you stream? I was like, oh yeah. Like, are you McBanterFace? I was like, oh yeah, that's me. That was kind of a funny way to start the weekend. But apart from that, I didn't get like recognized at all apart from Hearthstone people. But yeah, we're kind of like our own small bubble in that space because it is just so huge.
My favorite part of TwitchCon, which I didn't go to obviously, but I told Swaybe that she needs to go say hi to Eggs, and she actually went up to Eggs and said, "Hi, Tito says I need to say hi to you." So that just made my week. Doc, how about yourself? What have you been doing outside of the game?
Yeah, I'll keep it short because this is usually like one of my longer bits, but played some decent amount of Magic. I won my first 2 games of CEDH this weekend, which felt really good because I was playing my own deck and not like a true CEDH deck. There wasn't any like the color black at the table, so there wasn't a lot of like creature removal, and my deck that can play CDH is very creature based. And so I was able to get some big combos off with a couple of my creatures, and was able to just nuke each opponent on 3 separate triggers, and so that felt pretty nice. And then, yeah, I mean, just hanging out with the family, celebrated my mother-in-law's birthday last weekend or on Thursday. That was always a good time, and just getting ready for our trip out to Nebraska. How about yourself, Tito?
All right, Doc, 30 seconds. What do you think about the nerfs to Commander that seem to be fairly controversial this week?
Or
the bans.
It's all pod dependent. Like, yes, because what they're doing is they're banning like fast mana cards, which specifically is targeting people that don't really have like their own pods of like people they know. So when they go to like an LGS and play with people, just because the Rule Zero conversation, which they've leaned on for a very long time, doesn't really work because people still aren't honest about what's going on. And so they just got rid of some 3 big problem cards, one of which is the most expensive card that I own, and it's only viable in that one format because it's specifically to get your commander out. It's whatever. I mean, my pod that I play with is okay with running all the cards still, so it's just your play group. But for the people that took like a huge financial loss, I feel sorry for them. But like, it's why you don't try to invest in like CCGs or TCGs like Magic, because sometimes that happens, and then the cards that had a bunch of value don't have value anymore. But it's a game; you can still have fun. So enjoy the game.
And from what we can hear, Doc still invests in frogs. So
yes.
So for me, it's been kind of like last week. I think I mentioned that I had COVID the week before, and that was kind of a bummer. And this week, my kid's been sick. He spent Wednesday, Thursday, Friday home. I don't think he's ever tested positive for COVID, but it's probably COVID. So we're just dealing with that. Outside of that, I went to a thing on Thursday night, which was like, I'm still looking for a job, and it was like a networking thing with some people, and I was at Panera Bread, and I was like a little skeptical. Like someone suggested I go to it, and it was actually really good because it was more people there that were there to help people try to find a job and not like all the people trying to find a job. And they had a lot of good advice and there's some networking opportunities. So that was fun and exciting. But I don't think anybody cares about that this week. We have on McBanterFace. Let's get to know McBanterFace. What do you think, Doc?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So, Banner, how'd you get started in gaming and how'd you find Hearthstone?
As far as gaming goes, I mean, I didn't even really like get started. I just started, like when I was really young, I always enjoyed playing games. I couldn't even tell you like what the first game I played is or anything because I played stuff when I was young. I had a Game Boy and like a Nintendo DS and all these boomer devices. So when I was young, I always enjoyed that kind of stuff. We had a GameCube, so play like Smash Bros. My family had a Kirby Air Ride, bunch of like fun nostalgic games. It was just something I always enjoyed. Nice way to pass the time. And then Hearthstone, I actually started a little bit late compared to a lot of the like pro players. I started in 2017. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine in college, basically, we also played like Smash Bros. And we played a bunch of games together. And he showed it to me. And he was like, "Hey, I think you'd be good at this. I think you'd like it." And I was like, "All right, I'll try it out." So I started with Hearthstone Arena. That was where I began. I didn't start right away with Constructed or anything. Played Arena, and it was kind of like, "Oh yeah, I can like draft all these cards. It's pretty cool." And he like taught me how to play, which is kind of funny to like think back at now because like now I know that the way that I was taught to play was like totally wrong. I would like this might be a slight exaggeration, but I would hear things along the lines of like, "Oh yeah, they have a 1/1. You should coin hero power it to kill it, and then you get value out of your hero power." It's like stuff like that. Where if I heard it now, I'd be like, I don't know about that, but I was learning, and he wasn't like super good at the game or anything, but he had played it for a while, and so he introduced me to it, and I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll try it," and here we are. That's where it all began.
Heck yeah! So, how'd you decide on your gamer tag?
This one I have like I have a command in my chat because I get this question semi-frequently. Basically, I was looking for a gamer tag, and you guys know the story of like Bodie McBoatface?
Huh?
Yeah, it was that. So for anybody who doesn't know, basically there was like an online vote to like name this ship, and people naturally, because it's the internet, the name that won was Bodie McBoatface, and it was just so amusing to me that I originally made my tag actually for Smash tournaments because that was what I played in college before Hearthstone. I played Smash Bros. And we had like local tournaments and stuff. So my name was McBanterFace, and then I thought about it. I was like, that's a bit long, so I should probably shorten it a bit. So I took off the first one. It went with just McBanterFace. Yeah, that was how I got it, and then it stuck ever since.
Awesome. Who was your main in Smash?
So when we started playing Melee, and in Melee it was Marth. That was kind of how I started. So then naturally in Smash 4, I went straight to Marth, but I actually kind of went away from Marth a bit. I started playing Lucina, and then eventually my final main was Bowser. I got really good at Bowser, like at least compared to like a lot of other people. I was like the second best player in my school or something, maybe third actually, probably third. But we had some like local tournaments and stuff, and some like regionally ranked players. And once I started playing Bowser, I actually got like pretty competitive. He had some kind of OP moves and stuff, but you gotta use what you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So you always seem to be in the mix in the competitive Hearthstone scene. So how has the journey been for you to maintain a higher level of success at that level of play?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I think once you're actually there, it's not necessarily that hard to maintain. I mean, the hardest part of maintaining it is just keeping up playing enough and having like the motivation to grind ladder and all that, because you, at least in the current format, you usually have to grind a decent amount of ladder games. That's probably the hardest part, is sometimes finding that like motivation to play a bunch each and every day and try to get higher ladder finishes. But I think for the case for me, and probably for most people that are kind of like at the top of the Hearthstone competitive space right now, is that as long as you put in the effort, you're going to maintain whatever success you had before. Like basically all the same people. I mean, there's like a few exceptions, but I'd say probably at least 10 of the 16 people in Master Tours are basically the same people every single time. Because, for whatever reason, those people have a bit of an edge over everyone else. So as long as they're willing to put in the time to qualify, they probably will. And I think that's generally the case for me as well.
Awesome. So you came up just short against Pocket Train last year. A lot of people have been rooting for the both of you. What was that experience like?
I mean, overall, it was pretty fun. Basically, the story behind that was, I'm friends with Pocket. We kind of were chatting the entire year. We're always hoping that the other person does well. The previous part of that year went horribly for me in terms of the actual tournaments. So I didn't have super high expectations for the last one just because the first two went really badly. But, part of Hearthstone, you have to understand that there's a certain amount of variance. And so I was like, I'll put in as much work as I can. Hopefully the last one will go well. But basically, to put it, succinctly, there was some scheduling issues that the esports team had with the last tournament of the year, where basically we were like told a certain date and then it ended up not being that date. So me, Pocket, and Gamer RVG, as well as Fury Hunter, although he wasn't playing that tournament, but the three of us, we were in Vegas. We were in Vegas for TwitchCon because we were under the impression that the Master Tour would not be like soon after, but it was the next week. And generally when you're, prepping, you want like at least a week of prep time. We did not have that. So we were partying in Vegas instead. That was our prep for the tournament. So I think we both went in kind of very relaxed about it. And it was like, we didn't really have high expectations at all because it was the least prep we had all year. So it was kind of funny when we found ourselves in the final against each other. And it was pretty, for me, there was a lot on the line. For Pocket, there wasn't really much because he was basically already qualified. But it's also just more fun in general when you're playing against somebody So obviously it sucks to, lose one game from Worlds, which technically happened to me this year as well, although it's a slightly different situation this time. But yeah, it definitely sucked a bit in the moment, but it's like, I got over that one pretty quick, and there's always next year, which in this case is in a few months.
Now you guys were in the same practice pod, right? Am I wrong about that, or like you guys practiced together? Or
last year we didn't really prep. I mean, we kind of did. Like we had our own prep groups where we did most of our prep, but then we usually would like chat at the end of the time, basically before deck submission. So in this case, we talked like an hour before deck submission. We were like talking about our lineups, whatever. And we both actually, this is kind of the funniest part about us both getting to the finals, that we both changed our lineup. We basically took a deck from the other person and removed like a worse one, at least in theory. We were like, oh yeah, I think that this is probably a good idea. So we both took one deck from each other and we submitted this like 5 minutes before the deadline. So we did end up working together on it, and we ended up with the best lineup because we both made the final. So it has to be the best lineup.
Yep, that's how that works. So you told us that your signature match was probably your series with Muzzy back in 2021, especially Game 5. What about that game and that series is so special to you?
Well, so that was basically the context of that match this was my first season of Grandmasters, which for anybody who doesn't know is a little while ago. Basically, it was like the competitive circuit for Hearthstone, which is no longer around today. I think they discontinued Grandmasters in, I think 2022 was the final season of it. But basically, it was sort of like a league format where there was like 8-week season, and then you qualify for playoffs if you make the top 8, I think. There's 16 people, top 8 qualifies for the playoffs. So this was the playoffs, and basically at the time, I was a lot worse at Hearthstone at the time. I mean, I was good, but like, I definitely wasn't as good as I got at the game, a little bit later. So this was kind of my first big tournament. It was no secret that qualifying for America's Grandmasters was easier than every other region by far. So I did like really well in one master tour, and then I qualified, which that's a whole nother debate. But basically, that was my first like big tournament. And throughout Grandmasters, I did okay, but I like squeaked into playoffs barely. I wasn't like at the top of the league standings or anything. So I was probably like the biggest underdog going into the playoffs because I was one of the least well-known people. I pretty much had just started streaming a little bit before that, but I wasn't really like known super well in the competitive scene or anything. And most of the other people who were playing the playoffs were like way bigger names than me. Monsanto and Language Hacker, Nalgudon, basically, and Muzzy, all these people who have had like years of competitive experience. So I was like the big underdog. It was like a 2-day thing. And basically I got through on the first day, and the game against Muzzy ended up being in the finals of that, which means that was to get to the World Championship. So that was the third time that I've played one match essentially to get to the World Championship, which is a pretty stressful experience, I will say, especially for the first one. Like the last two, I had one this year against Maxi and then last year against Pocket. I'm kind of like used to it by then. Don't get me wrong, it's still, a lot of nerves, but you do get more used to it. Whereas then that was, my first time like competing in a big tournament, a ton of stress. I'm super nervous about like misplaying all this stuff. So I definitely felt the weight of that at the time. And that series was like the culmination of, that whole weekend where I had played really well up until that point. And one of the things I actually remember specifically about the weekend was they did like the caster predictions and stuff for who would win each Grandmasters thing. And, they posted on Twitter. This is when they had like decent interaction on this stuff. So at that time, like none of the casters had predicted me to win, which made sense. I wouldn't have predicted me to win either. But this was after the first day. And I remember Luna, who posted, and she was like, oh yeah, everybody's sleeping on McBanterFace. He played the best by far on day one. And I saw that, and that was a nice kind of like confidence boost where it's like, oh yeah, I can compete with these people. And I felt really good about the first day, but then day two is a whole nother thing because each match incrementally gets more and more stressful. I hardly even remember like the first match of that day. I think I played against Nalgudon, but the one that really sticks out in my mind is the one against Muzzy. Basically, that was a long way of saying that was all the build up to that match. So it was pretty much, I would say, I guess now like the second biggest match I played throughout my entire career. And that was pretty much the start of it for me. So it ended in a 5-game series where the last game, whoever wins, goes to the World Championship, which is like, it's
no pressure.
A lot of stress because, no pressure, right? It's like, in a nutshell, at least the way that, you're kind of thinking about it at the time is like, this is a minimum $25,000 match of Hearthstone at the very least, which is a lot of money for a game of Hearthstone. So when it gets to game 5, it's like, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm like, okay, I got to do everything perfectly, and I can still remember, I don't remember a lot of matches that I've played throughout my career. Like they come and go. I play a lot of Hearthstone, but I remember sitting at my desk, like shaking during those turns, like so like the most focused I've ever been during a Hearthstone game, and the amount of like stress that's going through my mind. And basically the way that it ended was like, he had like 2 lethal outs or maybe even 1 lethal out in his deck of like 16 cards. And I had set up lethal. I was playing Garrote Rogue also, by the way, which for those, if anybody doesn't know, it was not the easiest deck. So imagine playing that for a minimum $25,000 match of Hearthstone. It was a lot, but I was like, I had lethal set up. I had practiced this so much. I knew I was going to win as long as I could dodge a top deck. So I remember like waiting for him to draw that card, and I was just like head in my hands, like, please don't like get the one out. And after he took like 10 seconds on the turn, I started to feel safe. And it's like, you have that whole release of stress where it's like, okay, I'm going to win this. I'm going to Worlds. and you get to let all the excitement out after. So that was definitely the most memorable matchmaker. I will certainly never top that one.
I kind of feel
even
like
my matches in Worlds.
I kind of feel like your journey is a lot like Dogs, where like I know you're eventually going to win. And when he won against, I believe he beat Gallon right in Vegas to win it all, but he had always been like second place, and then he finally got there all. I feel like that's been kind of like similar to your journey, and then this year or next year, I think it's going to be just you're going to have your dog moment, and you're going to get there.
Yeah, that's the goal. I mean, we'll see how many tournaments we have left. I mean, that's a topic for another time, but I'm hoping that I have a few left. The goal is World Championship this year. I will hopefully qualify for that. I'm in a good spot for it. My last 2 tournaments, I got 4th and 2nd, so only one way to go from there, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think about the Grandmaster system?
So there was a lot of like controversy among that in terms of basically like a lot of people arguing that it was like too restrictive. It wasn't an open enough system, which I definitely get. For me, like personally, of course, I mean, I was okay with it because I benefited from it, right? And like, granted, I think I was less like aversive to the idea in general because I hadn't experienced the more open systems, because that was when I started. I started competing in 2020, so I didn't really get to go through all these master tours and like these open tour stops and in real life events and all that. I didn't experience that. I wish I did. That's kind of one of my regrets, is that I didn't get to go to that stuff because I was a little too late to the party. But I think because I didn't experience those, I was okay with the system. Of course, it benefited me as well, but just more from an objective point of view, I didn't think it was too bad. But I can see why when people came from the more open system, it would seem very closed off. And I think that's where a lot of the dislike of it came from. So I can definitely understand that point of view. But for me personally, I was okay with it.
I loved it, actually. And I wish that the only thing that was missing was that they could have had multiple leagues that were under Grandmasters. And if you lost, you just got relegated. And then if you did well in those other leagues, you got promoted. And I think that if they would have had that one level beneath, then you could have had more Hearthstone esports, and then you could have had more motivation, because it wasn't just those whatever slots. It was those slots and then all the tiers below it. And I get that, but you could have had more casters. You could have had more interaction. I think there would have been a lot of opportunity there, but that, I don't know. I love Grandmasters. I missed it.
Yeah, no, I kind of miss it too, but unfortunately that ship has sailed. I think I'm sure there's a lot they could have done with it. Especially like one of the big things was definitely the relegation thing. I think that was one of the biggest complaints, at least from players, was that if you got relegated, like you were done. It was so hard to actually get into, with the caveat that they're not American. But for like European Grandmasters and Asia Pacific, if you got relegated, like it was so hard to get back in.
But have you watched Ted Lasso?
Yeah.
Okay, they got relegated for a season, and then they were in the league below, and then they fought all season. They came back the next season. Tell me the best part about Hearthstone esports are the stories, and to have those stories, have someone get relegated, have someone get knocked out, and then have someone fight their way through the league below and get back in. Those would have been great stories, and I wish they would have done it. I'm sorry, but anyway, Doc, go ahead.
So you've been streaming Hearthstone and playing at a high level for quite some time now. Do you still like love the game, or do you view Hearthstone more as a job?
There's kind of like two parts to that answer. I'll always love Hearthstone as a game. It'll always be my favorite game ever. I don't think anything will change that. I've spent so much time playing Hearthstone and so many good years, so many good memories of it. Nowadays, I would probably consider it more of a job. I mean, again, the last like year or so of metas for me has just not necessarily been the best. I haven't really liked as many of the sets that have come out, and there's been a lot of repetition in decks. So I'm a bit jaded in that sense.
What's a good meta to you? Like, what is, like, if you could have your meta, what kind of meta do you love? Like, what would bring Hearthstone back to you as a love?
So I've talked about this on stream a bit, and basically my answer for that is I don't need I don't need a certain type of deck. I don't need this or that, and this can't be playable or whatever. All that I want in like my ideal meta is going to be some semblance of balance, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It's really hard to make it perfect. I understand that. Just somewhat balanced where there's no huge outlier that's like dominating the meta or a ton of super polarized matchups or anything like that. As long as we can have that, and then just some fresh decks, like stuff that doesn't feel recycled, or in the case of a lot of the recent decks, like I don't know how long Insanity Warlock or what other decks are like Overheal Priest, like these decks have basically been around and meta for like a full year more or less. That is where it's kind of like, okay, this is a bit much for me. I'm ready to move on. So as long as stuff is somewhat fresh and just reasonably balanced, I'll be happy. I have, a huge catalog of decks that I'm happy to play, aggro, control, mid-range, whatever you want to call them. I do not mind as long as it's stuff that's new and exciting, basically.
He did say mid range is something that exists, right?
So, do you think you'll retire when you win your championship?
Well, I mean, again, I don't know how many tournaments we have left. I hope we get more. It's really hard to say right now. It's like the Microsoft stuff is potentially a good thing. I think the biggest sort of positive assurance that we've had lately, not really an assurance, but just a positive note, is that China is coming back. So they expanded the World Championship, and I think that is potentially really good for competitive Hearthstone. So I'm hoping that we'll have enough tournaments left that I can have a good answer to that question.
No. You win 2024. What happens next?
It really would depend on what the competitive system's like. I wouldn't say that I would go the pocket route where I'm like, okay, I won, it's time. I mean, I do really enjoy streaming. I think for him that was like not to go off too much of a tangent, but I think the actual competitive Hearthstone stuff, it was stressful just based on the system, but he still kind of appreciated Hearthstone. It was more just like he tried to go into the streaming, and then he just didn't really like the streaming aspect. Personally, I really like the streaming aspect, so I don't think I would necessarily retire because it kind of goes hand in hand with the competitive stuff. I mean, sometimes, again, depending on how the system functions, it can be harmful to the stream, which I think has been a big complaint in the last year or two. But in general, I think it's a nice sort of side thing to have. It gives viewers somebody to root for. You have cool events that you can show them, and especially because my audience is, at least in part, still very competitive. Like a lot of them have come to my stream, whether or not that's why they're still there. They initially found my stream because I was good at the game, and I focused on competitive stuff. So I think having that kind of outlet is really nice. So my tentative answer would be no, at least not yet.
Nice. So when you think of life after Hearthstone, what does that look like to you?
More boring. I don't know. It's like I haven't given it a whole lot of thought recently. Before I got into Hearthstone, I kind of doing my thing. I mean, when I started playing, I was in college, and then right after college, I worked kind of just regular 9 to 5 at a marketing agency. Not the most exciting stuff. Okay, but I think there's definitely been more kind of interesting things and exciting moments that have come from Hearthstone. My only regret, again, is that I haven't gotten to do more in-person events, because that's been my favorite part of kind of joining the community, is like BlizzCon and TwitchCon. Some of my favorite times of the year. I've went to 2 TwitchCons now, and then last BlizzCon. Super fun events. You get to meet people in the scene that, from all around the world, from all different backgrounds. It really is a cool thing. So I would definitely be missing that, whatever I do after. I don't have any specific plans, though, but more likely than not, I'd probably just end up, working a pretty standard marketing job, continuing that career path. But I definitely think it would be less exciting.
What is your favorite class and favorite deck of all time?
Favorite class has to be Rogue. It's just the class that I've had the most decks that I've really enjoyed. Mostly the two that would come to mind would be Groat Rogue and Miracle Rogue. Specifically, like the one with concoctions, because there's been a lot of different Miracle Rogue versions. I didn't really play the one that was kind of original because I didn't play Hearthstone back then. But like the concoction version, love that deck. Super super fun. There's also like the Lackey Rogue back in the day, a little bit before. So many rogue decks that I enjoy, which I know is a controversial one for some people. I feel like it's very much like a love it or hate it type of class.
Yeah.
Which
I hated Concoction Rogue specifically because at the time I was playing a lot of Pure Paladin and stuff, and I like going tall. And Concoction Rogue was just like, oh hey, by the way, we're just going to destroy random enemy minions, and that felt really bad. So
that matchup was not playable for Paladin. I remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was not a big fan of Concoction Rogue, but
Mhm.
It is what it is.
Yeah, it's a lot more fun when you're the one playing it, for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would definitely say Rogue. And then favorite deck of all time, there's a bunch that could fit in there. I mean, Grow Rogue is definitely up there for me. I would say, just in terms of pure enjoyment, it would probably be APM Priest with Test Subject. I don't know if you guys remember that one,
Yes.
where you copy the boars. And this was when I was still like a lot more casual in Hearthstone. I wasn't nearly as good, and I didn't really play like a bunch of tournaments or anything. But I was playing in Tespa with some friends in college, and I remember watching Dog play that deck and just being like, "What? Like, this looks crazy. I want to do that." So I would like practiced that deck. There was like an online simulator. You use that? Yeah. So I would like do that and get good at the combo, and we ended up bringing it to a Tespa match. That was a very fun memory of mine. I think that would have to be, just in terms of pure enjoyment. I probably played it way less than I would have played Garrote Rogue or Miracle Rogue or anything like that, but that was probably my highlight in terms of Hearthstone decks.
Yeah. One final interview question for you. And this can either be something small or something big. It doesn't matter. But what would be something people would be surprised to know about you?
I don't think I'm too much of a surprising person. I feel like people know most things about me. I'm a pretty open book. I guess one thing that I don't necessarily talk about much, yeah, maybe mention it in like my bios or something, but it's not really something that comes up frequently, is that I really like to snowboard. I go every year. I've gotten like pretty decent at it. I mean, as decent as you get for going once a year. I'm actually trying to go like twice a year, but that's one of my favorite pastimes now. Everybody knows I love soccer, football, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of like a big part of my life. But then snowboarding is sort of my favorite like side activity that I obviously don't get to do regularly, but one of my favorite ways to spend time.
Just got to move to New England. It's all over the place.
Oh yeah.
All right, so we would be remiss if we didn't have you on and talk about how to be better at Hearthstone. Like, you are one of the top, I would say, 10 players right now, probably top 5 players right now. So you were talking earlier about how you started as an arena player and you were hero powering down on turn 1, or people telling you to do that. When do you think you made the jump from good player to great player? Like, and what clicked that really made you understand the game on like a bigger level, a higher level?
I think for me it would be really more of a gradual thing. Like, I can't point to like one thing or like one time where I was like, oh yeah, it's like this happened, and then you become good. I think for most people that's not the case. It was really just like I got more into the game, I got more interested in it, which meant that I started watching other people. I think that's generally, when it comes to my advice, that is pretty much the best way to learn, is to watch people that are better than you. That was when I kind of started to really understand things, because when you're just, playing by yourself, or even if you're playing with a friend or whatever, you can only learn so much. But when you watch somebody who's incredibly good at the game, like when I started, I was watching like Dog and Asmodai and No Hands Gamer, all these like really good players, way better than me at that time. And so I would like look at things and was like, oh, they did this, like I didn't even consider this. And every now and then you ask a question about like, oh, like what was the reasoning for this? that's why like whenever somebody asks me in my chat like why I did a certain play, I'm always happy to answer because I was at one point that person who was curious about those things. I think that's the best way to improve, and that's kind of how I made that jump. But it definitely was a gradual process rather than a like, oh, like I needed to know this and now I'm good now.
But what do you do now? Like you are one of the top players. You're top 5 player in the world always. So like, how do you get better now? Because there's always you're always trying to find the edge, always trying to improve. So now that you're
I
there, what do
don't.
you do?
I mean, I really I have kind of taken it more easy lately. Like I'm not really at the stage where I'm truthfully super hungry to improve. I've kind of focused more on um, I've tried to focus more on like the entertainment aspect when it comes to streaming because that is really what I've enjoyed lately. Well, in part that's just because there's not really a whole lot to compete in. You know, there's ladder stuff, but I'm going to stream that anyway. And then there's 2 Master Tours and the World Championship this year, and that's it. So there's not a lot of time to really like put into getting good at tournaments and all that. So instead, I've kind of taken it easy, and I will say that once you kind of have all this accumulated knowledge and you have these ideas of how every matchup plays out, and like when you are at the top of the game, I guess I think it is honestly pretty easy to stay there um, overall as long as you're continuing to play. But I don't necessarily look for a ton of things to improve. With that said, I'll still practice for tournaments and stuff, and I'll talk with other good players and every now and then, like Maxi will comment something and I'm sure like, well, why'd you do that? And I'll do the same to him. Part of it is kind of just for fun, but we do end up learning some kind of small things from that. But overall, I don't really put too big of an emphasis on improving right now for me.
Now, I know you said that last couple months you've been watching more and streaming less. I know I see you in some streams like Lorenda's stream and whatnot. What mistakes do you see people like? I'm sure you watch people because, like, if you're at the top of the game and you're watching other people, you're not just watching the 3 people better than you. You're watching everybody. You're watching a lot more people. What mistakes do you see a lot of people making that are keeping them from getting better?
I mean, there's a lot. I do coaching as well, so I get to hear also like certain, common mistakes that kind of come up for people. It definitely depends on where they're starting from, like a Hearthstone level. But like in general, I mean, I would say people not adapting to certain like matchups is kind of a big thing where people like learn a deck and it's kind of easy to like learn a deck and say, oh, this is an aggro deck, this is a control deck or whatever. And so they kind of get stuck in a certain mindset and then they'll queue into a matchup where that's really not the case, but they might not know that because they are kind of used to thinking in that sort of, just black and white, like this is my role, I have to stick to it. Whereas in reality, a lot of matchups you kind of have to change your role. It depends on, sometimes you draw the wrong half of your deck or this half of your deck or whatever, where you have to kind of adapt and you have to change your game plan. I think that's basically to sum it up in one word. I think adaptation is probably the biggest shortfall for a lot of people. And it's one of the hardest things to do because you can't necessarily teach that. You can get people to start thinking about it, but that is in part something that has to come a little bit naturally, and you do have to put the work in to actually think about that during pretty much every game you play.
So, what a good way to think about it, let's say you're playing Pirate DH versus Painlock. And then one of those, depending on how you've drawn and how they've drawn, you might not be the beatdown anymore. You might be now the control deck or whatever like that. And recognizing that and learning how to adapt your play, is that kind of what you're talking about?
For sure. I mean, like Painlock is actually a really good example because a lot of the time, the way that you're supposed to play against Painlock will depend on which cards you draw, no matter what deck you are. If you draw, a handful of bursts, like sometimes you have to, just say that you have to try and be the one to kill them. You can't actually control all the threats they put down. Maybe you're going to lose to Infernal. That's probably the other thing that I would say is the other biggest mistake that I see is people either there's kind of 2 things. Either people respecting certain cards too much or not respecting them enough, in the sense that sometimes people get so, in their head about, oh, like my opponent plays Brawl in their deck. So therefore, I cannot go wide on board ever. That's like one way of thinking about it. And then the other way that some people do is, what's Brawl? And then they just like play all their biggest threats into one board. And basically, there's a very healthy balance between the two. But I see those two extremes very, very often, where either people are just not thinking enough about what their opponent could do and what they should be playing around. And then the other side of it is, should you really be playing around, blank? Like sometimes against Painlock, I'll say this a lot on stream, where one of the things I repeat is like, if they have it, they have it. Like you can't play around every card in every scenario. Hearthstone in general tends to be a game of like probabilities, and you're trying to give yourself the highest chance that you can to win a certain game. You're not going to be able to win 100% of the time. Sometimes you have to let yourself lose to one card, but you can beat the rest. So that's a tough thing to get used to and a tough thing to teach, but definitely an important thing for improving.
Well, that's one thing that's made a difference for me is learning that. It's like, well, do they have it? You like sometimes you like, well, I'm not going to play this because they're just going to play this card, and it's like, no, play it. Make them have it. If they have it, great. If not, then you kill them. If they have it, well, you knew they were going to have it, but if not, then you can go forward. So that I think is one of the biggest deals is that tentativeness of, hey, I don't want to go wide. Like you're saying, I don't want to go wide because they're going to have Brawl. Well, go wide, make them have Brawl, make them play it, and then you can kind of, okay, a Brawl's gone. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next thing. And it's that tentativeness of not wanting to play your cards because you're expecting the reaction, where make them have the reaction. So that makes a lot of sense. And to what you were saying before, like for me, it takes a while sometimes to learn a deck. It took me a little while to learn Overheal Priest. It took me a little while to learn some other decks. You seem to swap between decks kind of effortlessly. So are there principles or fundamentals that you're applying when you take, like, hey, I'm going to take this Jombre deck and I'm going to go play it, and I just understand how it's going to work? Like, are there fundamentals that you're bringing to these decks, or what makes it easier for you to just take a deck and play it than the rest of us?
I mean, there's a certain amount of just Hearthstone fundamentals and principles that you're going to bring into every deck just naturally. And it's kind of hard to like put those into words, but I mean, that's just like basically the basics. And then, some people are going to be better at those basics than others. And when you have that kind of background and, like for me, I've played so many Hearthstone games throughout my Hearthstone career. I played so many different decks that I'm used to adapting to them quickly, and I always have my Hearthstone fundamentals to fall back on. Because one thing that's like pretty much always going to stay true, for example, in most decks is spend your mana, right? That's a super basic one that most people can do, apart from people who are kind of learning Hearthstone, which is something you have to get them used to. But like that's just kind of a small example of like, this is going to be true for 99.9% of decks. At least in the most situations, you want to spend your mana efficiently. So having, those kind of principles and fundamentals to start is always going to make it easier to learn the deck when you don't also have to learn that stuff, because that stuff needs to come first. And so when I do like deck roulette and stuff, and I mean, I would say in general, it takes me a few games to get like used to a deck. The first game I ever queue with a deck, a lot of time I'm still looking through the deck list. I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, what do my cards do? How am I supposed to win? Like a question that people commonly ask in chat is like, what's the win condition? It's a very, very common question that comes up. I'm sure you both heard that a lot. And like my usual answer is that I have just gotten used to saying this is, you reduce their health to 30. Like with most decks, that is just how it works. It's a sarcastic answer, but it's true. Like that's like a fundamental of Hearthstone. Now, for some decks, that's not the case, but for the large majority of them, you play your cards, you spend your mana, you do it more efficiently than your opponent, and a lot of the time you're going to win just based on that. So just having that kind of background, I apply that to basically every single deck, except when it's explicitly obvious that that's not how I should be playing it, and I'll tend to pick it up and have a pretty good idea of like matchups and stuff after 5-10 games. Definitely helps to watch people as well. If you've seen people play the deck, it'll come a lot easier.
Now you did mention fundamentals though. Like, what do you think are some of like the key fundamentals that people just don't really pay attention to, or people don't grasp, that you grasp when you take a deck?
I mean, I would say when it comes to like just pure fundamentals, I'd say most people have a pretty decent grasp on that stuff. It's, like at least for me, I consider it, the pure basics, like spending your mana efficiently, using your resources in a reasonable manner, like not
Mhm.
overextending completely into board clears while also making sure you put up enough pressure. Um, like when to trade and when to go face is a big one that comes up in a lot of different situations. Just that kind of basic stuff. I think as long as you have that down, it's an important base to start improving at any given deck. Because again, when you have to learn that stuff, it's a lot harder to focus on a deck's game plan
Mhm.
and what you're supposed to do when you're trying to learn how to spend mana in the first place. But I think like most people, above blank rank. I don't really have an exact number because the rank system is a little bit different. But what most people who are used to Hearthstone and played enough are going to be at least competent enough in those fundamentals to have a decent base for learning.
That's fair. So, actually, so I asked Hat, before we had this call. I was like, "Hey, like, is there something specific I should like talk to McBanterFace about?" And he's like, "Well, no, he's just a really, really good player." He's like, "Sometimes he makes trades that seem embarrassing, and he'll tell his chat to look away." So, what are you seeing in these trades? Kind of like when you're like, "I should make this trade. Look away. Don't watch me do this." But what are you seeing there that other people don't see?
So basically, that's like this comes back to one of the sort of important things for improving. I guess this is more of a, I guess, advanced concept in a sense of like when you're figuring out, how do I win, how do I lose, and you're adapting to a certain game state. That is kind of a big thing that is hard to do often, based on your hand, based on the board, all this stuff. When I make those trades and when I tell people to look away, I'd say 99% of the time, maybe 100% of the time actually, it's probably safe to say, I'm doing those because I know that the only way that I'm going to lose that game is by not trading. Um, because sometimes you have to make, I mean, or the alternative is I'm in such a bad spot that I actually have to trade to stay alive on board or something like that, where you have a 9-9 and they have a 1-1, and it's like I don't want to subject my viewers to that. I don't want to make them watch it, but I have to, because otherwise I know that I'm dead to a weapon that they drew from instrument tech or something like that. Uh, I feel bad showing it to people. Sometimes I'd rather concede. And then the other side of it is where I'm so far ahead that the only way I can lose is they have a 3-card burst combo from hand that requires their 2-1 to hit face. And it's like, well, I have a 10-10, but this is the only way I'm going to lose because I have, 10 healing in hand for the next turn or whatever it is. So I'm going to make the trade and then I'm always going to win. And people will complain and shout like, why'd you make me see that? But they'll get over it. You get the win and they move on.
No, I mean that's really good. And a lot of times it's hard to sometimes stomach those things where you're like, well, I could just push 10 damage face. I'm at 28 health, but it's like, well, no,
Mhm.
I need to get rid of that one because I know they have X, Y, and Z, or they could have X, Y, and Z, and yeah, maybe I just delay hitting them in the face for 10 a turn. But yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Um, what are some bad habits that you see that you would recommend people focus on fixing if they want to like get from being, I don't know, Doc, what are you right now? Plat 5.
Gold. Well, no, in Wild right now I'm gold 2.
All right, so if they want to go from gold to being a diamond player, or a diamond to being a legend player, or a legend player to being a high legend player, what are some bad habits that you think you see people playing when you're watching on streams that they need to fix?
There's definitely a handful. I mean, some that come to mind, like, I mean, again, it definitely depends on the person. I also do coaching, so I get a variety of different perspectives and different levels that these players are starting at. I'd say the one that comes up pretty frequently when I watch and when I coach is people often do not spend nearly enough time on their turn doing any meaningful sort of planning. Like sometimes they'll have 7 mana, they'll have like 4 cards they need to play, and they'll just like play a card. I'm like, well, what are you doing for the rest of your turn? Like you spent 3 mana, but you ordered the turn wrong or this or that. It's kind of like a simple thing that again at the top level, it's kind of a basic understanding that like you discover first, you draw first, at least with there's a couple exceptions, but as a general kind of rule of thumb, you do that stuff first. And the way that you get used to doing that stuff first every time without thinking about it is you make a habit of it. You always discover first. But basically you have to plan it, right? You have to figure out, I have 8 mana. And like, I mean, this even comes up for me. Sometimes I get really lazy when I stream, and like, I mean, last night I'll like point out and I'm like, oh, trade last, haha. I have a snake oil in hand. I'm druid, so I have 12 mana. And I'm like, well, I'm going to win this game anyway. I'll just start playing cards. Like, I'll do that sometimes. When people are trying to improve, I do not recommend doing that because it leads to a lot of complacency and poor ordering decisions. But like, I'll do it myself, so I know it's a thing. But I definitely see other people do it where they don't have a plan for their turn. They just have a certain amount of mana. They have a couple cards. They know they want to do this, or like they'll trade a minion first before discovering a spell that could maybe deal with the minion more efficiently, all that kind of stuff. You get used to it, but that's definitely a big one. And then I have another one. I guess another one, I mean, it's kind of related, but people often don't necessarily give enough thought to what their opponent is doing, like during their turn, and giving themselves, enough time to take that into account and kind of focus a little bit on their opponent's plan, because sometimes you can get a pretty clear idea of what your opponent has in hand or what they're trying to do based on what they play in a certain turn. But you really do have to pay pretty close attention. Like, this comes up, this is an example from last night where I was watching a game where somebody was playing against Pizza, and Pizza was playing Frost DK. And granted, during my streams, a lot of the time I'm not paying that close attention when I'm spectating, I'm just talking. But this time, for whatever reason, I was kind of paying attention, and I saw Pizza use a Frost Strike and generated a card. And then on the next turn, floated like 4 mana. And so I immediately said, oh, that's a Rezka. Like that's like 95% of the time that's a Rezka in hand, because, you kind of think about it and it's like, oh, they floated 4 mana. What would they have not played in this game state? Every other card I can think of from that has a Frost rune, he would have played. So then it's like, okay, I'm going to play around Rezka. And I think the person I was watching like played an ENR, and it was a Rezka, and they got Rezka and something like that. But just those kind of like small things, being able to focus on what your opponent is doing, and sometimes what they're not doing is really important. But it's something that people just don't really do. They take their turn, they go look off to the side, they watch a YouTube video or whatever, and then they're going to miss out on a lot of useful information. So definitely a good point of improvement for a lot of people.
Now, you were talking a little bit about planning your turns ahead of time, but it's not just the turn you're on. You're also planning on your next turn, your next turn, your next turn, right? So it's like, hey, if I play this 4 mana minion, what am I doing next turn? I have 5 mana. How is my mana going to work out? Say I don't draw anything that's worthwhile at this point. How far ahead do you plan? Like, what is it like? Are you an overplanner? Do you, not an overplanner, but are you good at planning out 6, 7, 8 turns, 5 turns, 3 turns? Like, how is your planning?
I am good at it. I would say that it definitely depends, like, because a lot of situations, you can really only, I always have a game plan, right? Like I know what I'm doing, broadly speaking, for the entire game, for the rest of the game, after like turn 2. Like, you have that idea, right? But it's very likely going to change based on what you draw, right? Because you can only make a plan based on what you have in hand and maybe what you expect to draw. Maybe you have like a tutor or something like that, like a creation protocol for priest, as an example. So you can make those plans, but you do have to be adaptable to what you draw, what your opponent does. That is kind of the hard part. But as far as planning goes, I have a general idea of what I want to do in every game and what I'm expecting my opponent to do on, turn 7 of the game or whatever. I have an idea. Again, you can't always necessarily win against whatever you think they're going to do, but it's good to have those ideas in place. And a lot of that does just come from playing a lot of Hearthstone. I've seen all these decks. I know their game plans. I know what Overheal Priest wants to do. I know what Big Spell Mage wants to do and which turns they want to do it. So as long as you have that kind of idea, you're probably going to be in a fine spot, as long as you recognize that you can't always stick to, what you initially planned.
Do you think that's something people struggle with? You just said you can't always expect to win. Do you think that that's like a big thing right there, is like not understanding that, hey, sometimes it doesn't matter how well you plan, you're just going to lose?
Oh yeah, for sure. I actually, there was a Rarn video that just came out I think yesterday, that he had me on, where basically he had asked me a similar question. He had a bunch of like card game pros on, and one of the questions he asked me was actually, I don't even remember the question, but I basically gave that answer, where it was like, you have to understand. I think you asked what percent of losses can you attribute to bad luck, and it's like the general idea is you have to understand that you cannot win every game. Now the caveat to that I think is important is that doesn't mean you should always blame bad luck in every situation, because most people who do that are probably making big mistakes that they are not aware of. But you cannot win every game. Like there's games that I've like coached people through where they're like, hey, what did I do wrong here? I'm like, well, not a whole lot. You can do this slightly better, but you're not going to win anyway, right? Like that's going to happen. It is a card game. I think that is a pretty important thing to understand. That it helps people not get tilted as much. I mean, I get kind of annoyed too. I'd say I don't get tilted very easily because I do understand that. But it's easy to get annoyed with Hearthstone, especially like sometimes things just don't go your way. You lose 5 games in a row and it feels like you can't do anything. That might be true for 3 or 4 of those games. Maybe one you do something wrong, but it's a good thing to keep in mind.
Now, one thing we talk about on this show a lot is reviewing your replays and having other people review your replays. How much do you spend? Do you spend a lot of time reviewing your plays, and do you have other people check them, say, "Hey, did I miss something here?" Like when you get to the level you're at, does that still come into play?
Well, these days, no, not at all. Like I talked about earlier, I'm not really focused on it as much nowadays. But definitely when I was like getting to this level, and I'd say even when I was arguably even better than I am now, or at least as good as I am now. Maybe like 2 years ago when there was more competitive stuff to focus on. Me and my main practice partner is Gamer RVG, so we would look at replays. He especially likes to do it, so I'll watch a lot of his replays. I haven't been necessarily as big on it, especially lately because I've gotten a bit lazy when it comes to Hearthstone tournament stuff. But definitely when I was like really focused and wanting to improve, I would pull up replays. We talk through turns, especially having somebody who is really, really good at the game to kind of evaluate them with you. And that's something that I also do, when I coach people. Basically, I'll like go through ladder games and then usually I'll ask to pull up the replay and go through turn by turn because there's only so much information you can get across during the turn. It's a lot easier to kind of go back and point out certain things, and you get to see all the information. Like like the HS replays will show you, as long as the cards were played, it'll show you like what the cards were in hand at the time, so you can point out certain things and certain concepts. So definitely a very good way to improve. It's just for a lot of people, it might be a little more on the boring side, kind of a little bit tedious, but it is a very good source for improvement.
So you play a lot of THL, you play a lot of big tournaments. How do you prep for like a tournament or like a league or something like that? Like, how do you figure out what decks you're going to bring, what you're not going to bring, and whatnot, aside from you and Pocket swapping information 5 minutes before a tournament?
Basically, I mean, the general kind of format for my tournament prep will be for every tournament for the last, I guess like 5 years, however long I've been competing, or a little under 5 years. I'll talk with Gamer RVG. We'll usually have like 1 or 2 other people in our prep group. More often than not, that kind of varies, but we're always the 2 constants. We've prepped for every single tournament. So we'll kind of go through, look at the meta. And the thing is, when you play as much as we do, we have a pretty good idea of which decks are going to be the best just at a baseline. Like, we're not starting from scratch, right? If you were to ask me now, what would I bring to a tournament tomorrow? It's like, well, I'm going to bring Overheal Priest. Like, that's the best deck. It has arguably no bad matchups, or at least definitely no matchups worse than like 45%. That's going to go in every tournament lineup. So I would say the general kind of sequence we go through is like we have like 2 decks that are clearly brings. And I think this is the case for most people, I would say, who do tournament prep, especially because we generally go for like the good decks lineup. For other people, this might be different. Some people go for like target lineups, or they have, certain types of decks that they really want to play. So they'll like kind of make sure they can fit those in. But for me in RVG, the way I've always done it is I bring the best decks and I trust myself that I'll play them well. And I know they'll be pretty good into the field. Sometimes they might try to target them or something, but the best decks are the best decks for a reason. So we usually have like 2 of those. It's like these 2, they're in almost certainly. It would be a shock if we didn't bring them. And then the 3rd and the 4th deck are the hardest part. That's always what catches up like every pro player, including myself. That's where you spend a week and you try every deck. You queue matchups with your practice partner. Maybe a third person is watching the games from like both perspectives as well, and you'll just do a bunch of matchups. It's a little bit boring sometimes, but you'll play as much as you can, as much as you have time for. Let's say the top like 15 decks in the meta that could theoretically be brought to a tournament, and you figure out what ends up looking the best on paper and also in reality. We look at stats, right? But there's definitely like some element of that doesn't necessarily translate to super top level play. I think Overheal Priest is a perfect example where the stats on Overheal Priest are a little bit lower than they probably should be. And then when you actually play the deck at a really high level, it's going to win way more often than not. And we saw that in the last Master Tour as an example, where I don't think it was the best deck on paper, but almost everybody knew that it was the best deck in the meta, maybe alongside Rogue, and it ended up having the highest win rate in the tournament by a pretty good margin as well, while getting banned a lot. So it's like you have to know which decks are maybe getting a little bit underrated in stats. But basically, the prep in a nutshell is just a lot of games. You have an idea, you try to, figure out which decks you're going to test because you don't have an infinite amount of time. But then you just got to play. You grind those matchups. You figure out maybe if stats are maybe a little bit not necessarily misleading, but maybe missing something in certain matchups. And then I'd say the last like day or two is figuring out the exact lists. But the most important part is figuring out which decks are going to work the best for a conquest lineup. And then the smaller stuff like, the exact tech cards or the 30th card in the deck comes at the very end.
Do you think a lot of the high skill cap decks are the ones that matter, like the Overheal Priest, the Garrote Rogue things, the ones that the elite players can play better than the plebs? Do you think that those are the decks that really kind of go above and beyond, or is it kind of just random?
I would say to some extent, yeah. Like, there's definitely some of those decks that are not as good as pro players will make them out to be. They just like feel smart playing them. But more often than not, that there tends to be like one or two decks in a meta which are maybe a bit harder than the rest. Again, in this case, is Overheal Priest and then the Sonya Rogue. The Sonya Rogue is another good example where on stats, it was like maybe a 50% win rate deck, something like that, maybe even below. I think at if you looked at like just legend stats or even like diamond through legend, it was like 40% win rate. And so like if you looked at that, you'd be like, oh, of course I'm not going to bring that to a tournament. But once you kind of have enough experience and you see the deck played, actually a kind of funny story from the last tournament was that deck popped up and I pointed it out. I was working with Fury Hunter and Gamer RBG, and I pointed out the deck and I was like, this seems like it might be kind of broken. So we're like, yeah, we should test this because the stats on it were pretty bad, but it like sometimes you just know when a deck is good. You see it played, it's like this looks strong. So we tested it, and basically Fury and RVG played it first, and they were losing a lot. They could not really win with the deck, and they were ready to give up on it. They said, this is way too hard. It's too hard to play perfect. It's not worth bringing. So the next day, they're like, okay, how about you try it? So I queued it up and I played it in like a slightly different way. And like I will say, like Fury Hunter, better Hearthstone player than me for sure, but sometimes you just need a different perspective on it. I played it with like a different style, and I went like 90% in practice. They were like, wait a minute, you can do that? Like, so then they started doing it and they started winning every game. And it was like, oh, like we were missing this one key piece of information. And then all of a sudden this, 40% win rate ladder deck was a must bring. And we immediately put it in our lineup. We figured out the best list, and almost everybody brought it to the tournament. So like that kind of thing, that's where like the prep comes in. You have to be willing to put in the time and the effort to test those. We almost ended up dropping it because after the first day, people weren't winning enough. And, it was so hard to play perfectly that people were concerned that they wouldn't be able to pull it off in tournament. But that's where I think the bulk of the prep comes in, and that's where you get the biggest benefit is being able to actually figure that stuff out with other high level players.
So we're coming up on Worlds. You got a couple more months left, right? You said you've kind of like you don't really watch replays anymore that much. You feel like you kind of are there any holes in your game left? Like if you were like to say, hey, Mr. McBanterFace, I'm McBanterFace from the future, you need to plug this hole up in your game. You need to get better at this. Do you have anything left that you think that you are that people can exploit?
Not really. I mean, not in terms of like exploitable stuff. Like the biggest thing for me right now is the biggest obstacle for me getting to Worlds is just going to be me putting in the effort to actually queue enough games on ladder, because I it's not a secret that I have not been super fond of the game lately. So I think throughout this entire month, I probably queued I don't know, 200 something ladder games, which for some people is a lot, but just for context, I'd say most like professional players probably get closer to like 1,000 for a month of ladder, particularly in competitive months. That's usually around the number that people will play. I've always been on the lower end. My goal is to have a higher win rate and play less games if I can. I mean, I think everybody wants to do that ideally. I don't want to go crazy queuing infinite amount of Hearthstone games. I probably usually hit around 600, maybe 700 in those really competitive months where I'm trying to get a top 5 finish. And in this next month, it's a bit different because it's only a competitive month for the people who can qualify for Worlds, which effectively means there's about 10 people on the planet that have an actual interest in their ladder rank for the next 2 months. And I happen to be one of them, which should make it easier, really, to get good ladder finishes, because there's not going to be as much, significant competition, at least in theory. That's going to be the hardest part for me, is just sitting down and playing those games, even if I'm not necessarily having a good time with the meta. But I know that I need to do it because it would frankly just be silly for me to not qualify at this point. It would just be a bad decision. So as long as I do that, I think I'll be okay. But that's the biggest hurdle at this point.
All right. So I personally, I make Legend every month, but I'm a 10-star player. I've made 11-star a couple times. I'm trying to become an 11-star player where every month it's just kind of the thing. And then next I want to try to get into that top 300 people every month that, whatever. What advice would you have for someone like me that wants to get from being like a good player, a pretty good player? I mean, I guess I would consider myself a pretty good player if I'm making Legend every month. What advice would you have for someone like me that wants to get to be a pretty good player and become a great player?
I mean, again, I think the main thing it would come back to would be watching people who are better than you, like particularly streamers, content creators. That's one of the best things you can do. It's the easiest source of accessible, free coaching, essentially. It's not necessarily going to be super in depth all the time, but you can ask questions. Like No Hands is somebody who's also good at doing this. I try to do it on my stream. I talk through my plays. I explain why I'm doing certain things. That stuff can be really valuable, especially when the person playing is rank 10 legend, right? They probably have some amount of knowledge that let them get there. So watching those people, there's definitely some amount of like responsibility you have to have for yourself, and not being somebody who's like, oh, I'm just unlucky, because you definitely, I'm sure you guys both have heard these people is like, everything is just because they're unlucky, it's never their fault. It's easy to have that kind of mindset, but if you're serious about improving and getting better, it is important to not have that mindset and to be open to learning new things and fixing some of your mistakes. But I think the easiest way is definitely to just watch other people, ask questions. That's definitely a big thing about certain things. It's honestly one of my favorite things when people ask, like, why did you do this specifically? I'm always happy to answer. I like helping people. So I think that would be my main piece of advice.
That's fair. And I'm on Twitter. I understand how people blame RNG on just about everything. And maybe I need to stop watching just Lorenda because he doesn't seem to ever know what's going on. I don't know what's going on, what's happening here. All right. Well, Doc, that was a lot of information, but I think I'm ready for a little dessert. What do you think?
Yeah, dessert sounds pretty good. So, Banter, what is your favorite dessert?
It might be a bit boring, but for me, it's coffee ice cream. That is what does it for me. I used to be a big dessert guy. These days, like I don't have as much of a dessert stomach. When I was a kid, I eat my dinner. Oh, I want dessert. I'm ready. But like these days, I can't do it as much. So one of the easiest things that I can actually feel like I have room to have is ice cream, and coffee is easily my favorite flavor. So I got to go for that.
And that's a New England thing too. I'm kind of impressed. That's kind of like coffee is really a New England flavor. So good for you.
uh, listeners, please leave us a review. We prefer 5 stars, but give us an honest rating on how you feel the show is doing. If you leave us a review or send us an email, we'll read it out on the show. Just helps with visibility, helps us know how we're doing, because we want it to be the best it can be for us, but also the best it can be for you. So, Banter, if people listening to this don't know where to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
Twitter and Twitch, those are my main 2 platforms. Unfortunately, I don't do YouTube, but Twitter at McBanterFace, twitch.tv/McBanterFace. Keep it simple. Consistent branding, all that. So I try to stream pretty much every day, day or 2 off each week, but I stream at incredibly strange hours, usually at like 9 or 10 p.m. Pacific. And I stream throughout the night. So that is where I will be.
No, more importantly, you've mentioned several times in the interview we had today that you do coaching. If people say, I want to get coached by McBanterFace, how do they do that?
Yeah, you can either reach out on either of those platforms. I have like a command on my stream. I do coaching on MetaFi now. That's where I offer it through. So I have like a page where it's easy to get a bunch of information. I have like a couple preliminary, very quick questions when you sign up for coaching about, your rank, how long you've been playing Hearthstone, all that. So that would be metafy.gg/McBanterFace. Yeah, that was the one. But yeah, also just if people want to pop into my stream, if they have any questions about that stuff, I have like a command for it, which links them there.
Sadly, I'm East Coast and I can't because I'm usually in bed by the time you're streaming. But Doc, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can primarily find me on Twitter, and then most weekends you should be able to find me on Twitch at Doc McButt.
And you can find me. You can find me on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, and if I'm not somewhere, let me know. Tito Santana HS. McBanterFace, you got anything you want to shout out or promote this week?
Well, I guess this isn't even a thing for me, but it's kind of related to what we've been talking about. Rarin put out a pretty interesting video yesterday. I think it was yesterday about basically he asked me and then a bunch of people who are way bigger creators than me. The topic was how to get good at card games. So some of the stuff we covered today is kind of in there with maybe a bit more of a humorous take on it. But we did ask some of the similar questions. So I just want to check that out. It was a good video and I think pretty entertaining and some good info in there too.
Doc, how about yourself?
Yeah, just Banner, thank you so much for being willing to carve some time out of your day to join us and talk about Hearthstone. And it's always a pleasure to talk with someone who understands the game at the highest level and to just get to pick your brain. So thank you so much.
No problem. It was fun.
How about yourself, Tito?
Pretty much the same. I don't have a lot going on this week. So thank you, Pilot, for doing duos with me. Sorry we didn't win it all. We ran into that tough Ron Mexico Brushy Tuna team. They seem to be really, really good at Hearthstone. We'll get them next time. But anyway, guys, I think we're toast. I think we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Peace.
Slide two brothers meet one another when they slide up to the mic. It's bread and butter with one another. Let's start up that recording light.